A special thanks to all the sponsors of the Myth Information Conference 3 in October. Author of the new book, Mythos Christos, Edwin Herbert, Atheist Republic, Godless Engineer, Kenosha Racine Area Freethinkers, Atheist Community of Milwaukee, Freedom from Religion Foundation, the Sophia Wolf Quadracci Memorial Fund for Stem Cell Research. And please remember that your purchase of a $300 sponsorship table for the event includes 1 ticket to the conference and 1 ticket to the VIP party, and also gets you mentions on all of our social media platforms as well as this podcast. And a very special shout out and thank you to all of our patrons who support the show.
Welcome back to a special episode of the Mythicist Milwaukee Show, where we're keeping the all-seeing eye of Horus on the secular movement. And today we have a great guest that I've been looking forward to, Faisal Saeed Al Mutar. Faisal is an Iraqi-born writer, computer geek, and human rights activist. He is an advocate for secularism, human rights, and the free market of ideas. Faisal is the founder of the global secular humanist movement and Secular Post. He's written in many different publications, including the Huffington Post, the Humanist, Free Inquiry Magazine, the National Post in Canada, The Big Think, Richard Dawkins Foundation of Reason and Science, Secular World, Secular Nation Magazine, and others. He spoke at venues and conferences such as Google, Cornell University, Columbia University, Harvard University, the Berkman Academy of Music, and the list goes on. He is on the educational board of Applied Sentience, which I think is super cool. That is just an awesome name. Applied Sentience works in cooperation with 6 different university humanist organizations. Welcome, Faisal.
Hey, how are you?
I am doing good. Really good to have you on board here. Tell me a little bit about the goals of some of your organizations, the Global Secular Humanist Movement, as well as kind of the movement.org.
Well, with the global secular humanist movement, I mean, we're utilizing the technology of social media and stuff to spread the ideals of humanism and globalism. And now, I started myself, but at the end, like now it has multiple admins from my friend Melissa from Singapore, Ala Rizvi from Pakistan, and many others from all over the planet to some extent to create a movement, a global movement to spread, and also to stand in solidarity with each other and try to say that the humanists of the West should stand with the humanists of the East, and we kind of have similar goals there. As with movements.org, so Movements is a crowdsourcing platform that the technology of crowdsourcing is that people who can sign up and apply their skills to help activists in closed societies, and that obviously includes societies like in the Muslim world, like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and Iran. So for example, like if someone says, I'm a human rights activist in Afghanistan, want to get published in the media. And then let's say you are a journalist who also signs up and say, I'm interested in covering stories about Afghanistan. What we do like a match.com between those who have skills to help and those who request these skills.
Because the Times of Kabul is not going to publish what she's going to do.
Yes, and not only that. I mean, now there's like the blogosphere, and that's kind of common in these closed societies in which people. But what's happening is that many of the West are not familiar with that these people exist. Like many in Western media will just see, let's say, for example, in Afghanistan and Iraq, well, they see the Taliban throwing acid on faces. They see continuous terrorist attacks and so on, but they don't see the people, the courageous people, the brave people who are doing amazing work, who are trying to change things for the better. Also considering that here in the Western media, the narrative, the Arab or Southeast Asian population has generally been like the apologist and the Islamist and so on. There's hardly been any coverage of human rights activists or secular activists or liberal activists. Many people don't know who they are. So through movements and which we have partnership like with companies like the Huffington Post, the New York Times, Women in the World, and so many others. People can see the list of partners we have. We're able to give these people a global voice to some extent, in which their articles can spread all over. In the previous project I had, before Movements, was Secular Post, in which I was publishing the secular articles of people from closed societies. But now, considering that I have much more leverage and I'm able to use like tools like the Huffington Post and so on, I see that considering they already have a constituents, they already have a big fan base. So I just moved some of the people who were published at Huffington, Secular Post to Huffington Post.
What was available, like before this, what was available to these people, say without this organization, if you were an activist in Iraq or in maybe Iran or, in a closed society in Pakistan?
Yeah.
Like what was available? Could you even put this out on your Facebook, or would there be repercussions? What could they do?
Well, I mean, obviously it's a country by country basis, and there are countries that are better than others, there are countries that are worse than others. What I have noticed, I mean, I think that's kind of recent, is that many people are no longer afraid and kind of very fed up with the situation. Is that they're much more in touch with the situation. I mean, if somebody, let's say, lives in northern Baghdad, okay? ISIS is not that far away from they live. It's not that they need a flight to go to ISIS. It's just a few hours of drive, maybe less. So they see kind of like many people are like putting their names in public on Facebook and Twitter, who no longer say, you know what, I'm going to speak up. I'm going to put my real name. Some other countries in which, like countries like Saudi Arabia, considering that they have a very strong rule of law, and the government and they have the religious police that are tracking people, it kind of makes it more difficult, because I mean, in Iraq, one of the good and bad things is that we don't really have a functional government. So the only danger you have are from the militias, not from the government. But with Saudi Arabia, for example, the government controls the internet, controls any form of, now they're using apps like Telegram and WhatsApp, which with very huge encryption. But even with that, there are still people who are like secularists in Mecca, emailing me, like in Mecca. Like, who would have thought? Like, there is a place as conservative as, probably ultra conservative to say the least, can have such voices. So I'm like dedicating most of my time to help these voices to, first of all, organize and connect with each other, and as well as getting some help.
I see that movements.org is bringing a lot of professionals that will do some of the logistical work, such as the legal piece, infrastructure piece. And you've explained a little bit of what your contribution is. You mentioned as well that individuals are now feeling more open to express themselves, even in your own country of Iraq. Do you see yourself being able to go back to Iraq, contribute your part of movements.org at the local level in Iraq at this point, or do you see that even being able to happen in the future?
Well, I mean, now I'm in the United States under political asylum, and I'm legally not allowed to go back to Iraq until I become a U.S. citizen. But I mean, I think that my biggest contribution would be, considering that I speak two languages and being able to connect kind of the world of the East and the West, I think my biggest contribution is to continue being that third party who's able to connect both sides. Obviously, there is a lot for me to contribute as long as I'm alive. So I think, I mean, I was kind of very close of being assassinated in Iraq. So I'm not sure like going back would be the best way for me to continue breathing, at least at the moment as we speak. Maybe the situation will get better. That may put a possibility that I may go back there for at least a while and try to help people on the ground more there. But I think that considering that there is already an existing movement in these countries, I think the best thing I can do is just to connect them with people, with professionals and so on, that they can help them to change the situation over there without me being there.
With Global Secular Humanist Movement, you being the founder, as you've mentioned, do you have a significant following back home in Iraq and perhaps neighboring countries? And have you facilitated movements? Have you facilitated asylum for individuals through this? Have you provided logistical information for them to keep themselves safe, or also continue your movement through these facilitators in Iraq?
Maybe even keep breathing, right?
Right, exactly. Stay alive.
I mean, it may come to your surprise, but like, I mean, so now the page has more than on Facebook, it has more than 350,000 followers on a global level. There's a very significant amount of people from the Arab world and Pakistan and so on. As of like the business of getting people out, that's one of the most difficult ones, because it really depends on the country and the visa and the passport and so on. But there were some cases in which, so for example, there was a Saudi person who came out to his parents, and luckily he also had an American passport. So what we helped with, we raised him funds, and we got him a flight from from Saudi Arabia. Like it was a kind of like a 24-hour notice. Raised the funds, get him a flight, flew him to the United States, and now he's in a safer place. And in some other cases, I mean, we connected some people to lawyers and like in the case of the Bengali bloggers, some of the Bengali bloggers who are still in Bangladesh, who are like on the death list of Al-Qaeda, some of them contacted us and we helped them getting published. And that article that we published, they gave to the Swedish embassy and they were able to fly from Bangladesh to Sweden getting a visa. So when it comes, so like, as I said, like each country has its own logistics that makes it, the countries that don't need visa, for example, to the West, or the visa is easier, that will make things much easier. But if countries like Pakistan and Iraq, in which like is considered like one of the worst passports in the world because you would need a visa everywhere you go, that kind of makes it very difficult.
Now, as you've spoken to individuals being able to come to the United States, that brings into a little bit of a segue. Recently, with some of our candidates, the political conversation has been mentioning the immigration of Muslims to the United States. What do you believe it'll take for this country to switch its viewpoints as a whole to Muslim immigration or Muslims immigrating to the United States? And also with that, do you see culturally the immigrant Muslim population being able to assimilate itself to the United States cultural system?
Well, I mean, I think for a start is, whatever term we're going to use, refugees or immigrants, is that we have to acknowledge that, first of all, they're humans. And with humans, you have a huge spectrum of what type of belief they belong to and what type of oppression dynamics that they suffered from, or the oppression that they may bring to the United States when they come here. So I think that need to be done with a kind of a very strong vetting process, and at the same, and also acknowledging that some beliefs within the Islam or the Muslim community could be non-integratable in a Western context. How can you change that? And I mean, generally the case, I mean, which kind of quite frightening, and at least in some cases in Europe, is that it's not only the refugees who are the ones who bring extremism, but rather the children who, like the first generation immigrants, second generation immigrants. I mean, many of these people who committed the terrorist attacks in Europe were not the refugees. They were the children of refugees or immigrants who came from the 50s and the 60s from Pakistan and so on. And that raises a big question about the people who are born the West with a Muslim identity. Are they having an identity crisis that gets them more to some of them, I mean, at least not all of them, but some of them brings them more to the extremist narrative than the moderate narrative? I mean, these are questions that are being debated on constant basis in Europe, and at least European media and American media. So, I mean, I think that, yeah, first we have to acknowledge that they are humans. The second of all, we have to acknowledge that there is an extremist version of Islam that is incompatible with Western values. That doesn't mean that all versions of Islam are incompatible with Western values. I mean, my parents are Muslim and they immigrated here to the United States. They're mostly liberal. They don't think that infidels should burn in hell. But at the same time, there are people who also came to the United States who believe these kinds of stuff. So how can you be able to differentiate? And it's I think it requires people with extensive knowledge and being able to be just blunt and admitting about the problem, and not try to obfuscate and say, no, all refugees are a bunch of victims and all of them can integrate in the West, because that's just pure delusional.
What allowed your parents to be so open-minded? Because it seems like even when you were back in Iraq, they gave you some shelter within your own home to be able to think for yourself and to think freely. Well, what do you think attributed to that ability for them to think almost in a secular mindset living in Iraq at that time?
Well, I mean, to a large extent, I mean, my parents' version of Iraq is kind of very different than my version of Iraq. I mean, my parents grew up in Iraq in the 60s and the 70s, in which Iraq was fairly liberal, and I mean, obviously the big cities in terms of, because they went to Baghdad, and they also happened to study in the West. My dad studied in the UK. That definitely played a role, I think, in their thinking. But as I said, like the Iraq that they grew up in was much less extreme. Iraq in which it had bars and it had fashion weeks and had women wearing much differently than as you see right now in places like Mosul, and in general, the society in Iraqi society was much more open in the 60s than it is right now, and you can see the same cases with Iran and so many Afghanistan and so many other places. They kind of just kept the tradition that they grew up with to some extent, or the environment that they grew up with. Now things look very different, in which, like, you see that the people who were raised in the 80s or in the 90s have a very different. I mean, I have a very different vision of. I mean, the Baghdad that I grew up in was not the Baghdad that was safe and had bars and clubs and so on. I mean, it was in continuous civil war. It was in Al Qaeda roaming around. There is a huge lack of order. There's hardly any functional government. But that was not the Iraq they grew up in. So I think they just continued the tradition of the society that they grew up in back then.
Right. I really like the idea of the global secular humanist movement, because it kind of disproves the whole. I hear a lot of the narrative on the far right is that only the West can be liberal, that somehow that Islam is incompatible with values, and that isn't true, because I've met personally 5 different atheists from Saudi Arabia, and that's just me. So they're definitely there, and I think giving them a voice is a big deal. And I kind of want to talk what's wrong with both of the narratives, like kind of what's wrong with the narrative on the far right, and what's wrong with the narrative on the far left, or sometimes we call them the regressive left now.
I don't think they have very much of a different narrative. It's just that with the far right, they believe that people from the Middle East are incompatible because they are inferior, and the people on the far left believe that they are incapable of being liberal because it's U.S. fault. So at the end of the day,
so it's all Islam or all U.S. foreign policy.
So at the end of the day, both sides do not. So either the far right will put the blame on the Muslims or the Arabs and so on, but to say that no, they're incapable. But with the far left, they will say no, they're incapable. It's because of us. Right. So these sides both are racist, in my opinion, because they're putting judgment purely on the race of the person, Arab and Pakistani and so on, without looking at the dynamics and the culture that existed in the Arab world, and the Arab world, and even countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh and so on. They are in constant conflict with each other. I mean, as you can see, there are civil wars between Sunni Shia, but there's also a civil war or a war of ideas happening between the conservatives in that part of the world and the liberals in that part of the world. These societies are not monolithic, and with this narratives, I think, of the far right, of the far left, is it ignores the people who need the support the most, people like Raif Badawi, for example, who wrote from Saudi Arabia, amazing blogger, wrote amazing things. Now he's in jail,
facing 1,000 lashes.
Yeah, I mean, he got 50 so far, and I think he has more years in jail. And his amazing wife, Insaf Haidar, is doing an amazing job in trying to release him. But like voices like Raif Badawi are, in my opinion, are the solution. But they tend to get ignored, unfortunately, by both sides of the narrative, because they either believe that these people do not exist, or believe that these people are somehow not authentic voices of that part of the world, which is complete racist, in my opinion. What is the authentic voice? What is the authentic voice of white people? What is the authentic voice of black people? Each people have different experiences, have different upbringings, different education. That's itself kind of problematic, and that's what, in order to find a kind of a solution to that bad narrative, is to show that these voices exist, and to show them as forcefully as possible. Obviously, and supporting them as much as possible. I mean, they exist in as countries as extreme as Saudi Arabia. They exist in other parts of the Muslim world. And there's a project that I been recently interviewed by. It's called Free Mind TV, which is like the first secular Arab web channel.
Free Mind TV?
Yeah, Free Mind TV. It has a staff from Egypt, Algeria, all over the Arab world. And they interview people in Arabic, the Arabic thinkers. And there are many, there are tons of people. But you hardly see that on the website.
You don't.
You don't. You see somebody like Reza Aslan. You see somebody like...
Or worse, Anjem Choudhury debating on Fox News and debating Hannity. And you say, wow, Anjem Choudhury is a very, very conservative, extreme Muslim that wants... to imply Sharia law in Britain. And this is certainly not the voice of all Muslims. But yet it's cast that way.
I mean, there is no such thing, in my opinion, as such a thing as the voice of all Muslims.
Right.
I mean, Muslims...
Or most, even.
Yeah, I mean, Muslims belong into a spectrum. And that being said, there are better versions of Islam than others.
Yes.
The version of Islam that is compatible, or the Muslims who have beliefs who are compatible with, I mean, leave aside the term Western values, but just let's say universal human rights.
Right. Which is a much better than narrative than Western values. I agree.
They hardly, because they get to some extent attacked by both sides. The far right will say that these guys are just lying about what they believe, and the conservative Muslims call them non-real Muslims or blasphemers,
Uncle Toms, if you will.
Yeah, and so many other names, and Zionist and whatever they come up with these days. So these voices, I mean, I think now to some extent are getting some coverage, but it's still not enough, because compared to the other side, the Islamists and the Brotherhood,
yes.
and they have been pretty much dominant in the media for a very long time, that it would need a much longer process to show that other voices, the non-apologists, the people who take responsibility exist, and they need help, and they have projects that they're working on.
Right. And so instead of calling like the Council CARE or the Council for Islamic Relations always as the spokesperson for Muslims, which again isn't a good idea, but to get some more of these people on there, like I would love to see you being called on Fox News to give an idea instead of some of these apologists. And we do need to bring more light too. And the folks that I know are you, Faisal, also Irshad Manji and Majid Nawaz is over in Britain. Who are some of the others that maybe we can give a voice to here? Just maybe people can Google them.
And you mentioned Irshad Manji and Majid Nawaz. They are more what's called the Muslim Reform Movement. So there's now actually, I think, a website called the MuslimReformMovement.com, and people can check it on Facebook, in which it has the people who, like, for example, Asra Nomani, she used to work with the Wall Street Journal, and now she's also like writing about reform and so on. There is, I mean, my best friend Al Rizvi is actually publishing a book this year called The Atheist Muslim, which is kind of very interesting.
Where does he live?
He lives in Toronto.
Okay.
There's Sarah Haider from the Ex-Muslims of North America, and Muhammad Sayed. That is at least in the English. I mean, there's Iki Muthali. She writes for The Nation, Pakistan. I mean, these are the ones who exist, who are live in the West and so on. There are so many other voices who actually live in, for example, in Iraq. There is a thinker called Ayad Jamaluddin who is also Muslim. I mean, I would call him. I mean, he's a secularist. He's a Muslim secularist. There's a guy called Ahmed Al-Qubanchi. So I mean, these voices exist. When it comes, I mean, for the West, I think the Muslim Reform Movement that kind of was recently formed brought most of these Muslim Reform voices together under one umbrella. That if people I mean, their names are increasing. I mean, even with Majid Nawaz, the Quilliam Foundation, they are having new people who are Muslims joining up their organization, who are becoming a new spokespeople. So yes, I mean, when it comes to CARE and the so-called representatives of the Muslim community, I mean, as I said, I mean, I don't even believe that Majid Nawaz is a representative of the Muslim community, because there's no thing as a representative of the Muslim community as a whole. They are spread out all over countries. There are Muslim Americans, I think, between 2 and 4 million. Who some of them are medical doctors, some of them are taxi drivers in New York, and they don't have one representative because they follow different beliefs and different values, at least to some extent. I mean, there are sometimes that these beliefs are closer to each other, but which voices that we prefer? I think the voices that bring solutions to these issues
with better ideas,
with better ideas and new ideas, fresh ideas, and so on. I mean, I'm sure I've noticed with CARE and so many others, it's just like they have a press release. Whenever there's an explosion in different city, they just change Paris to Brussels, and it's like the same words, and as if like nothing has changed. There's no solution whatsoever, and the only solution is
this, right?
Yeah, the only solution actually, I mean, eventually turns out that the solution actually has to come from the U.S. government, because the U.S. government is the one that brought all that to itself.
Which is absolutely untrue. I mean, I think Wahhabism, which is really at the heart of this, forms in the early part of the 1700s, before America was even independent, right? We're a bunch of colonies. This is England's fault now.
Yeah, and that is, I think, it's one of the biggest issues, like that is kind of a biggest obstacle, I would say, to progress in these societies, in the Muslim world in general, because it's now being a trend. There's always been a trend that there is no responsibility whatsoever. There's very, very little. There's so much criticism of other people, very little self-reflection and self-criticism, which is, I think, the method to progress is like when people admit that they are not perfect, or their ideology is not perfect, then they can correct it and they can follow a more benign ideology. But unfortunately, there are folks who want to keep the status quo and will be the first to condemn others when they say something ridiculous, but will be the last to condemn their quote unquote their people when they say something ridiculous. I mean, there was this cartoon which I really liked. So it says like somebody like has a Saudi flag and they said like, we condemn Donald Trump ridiculous statements. And then on the back of it, it says, no Christians are allowed to be built in Saudi Arabia. No women are allowed to be, women are not allowed to drive. Free speech is almost non-existent. And yet you are so quick to condemn Trump for being a racist. But at the same time, you don't say that maybe not allowing to build churches and not having religious freedom in Saudi Arabia is not something that you should think about. So you condemn somebody else not respect for religious freedom, and yet you're the first who not.
Right.
So there is.
You can't tell somebody they stink if you haven't taken a shower in 6 days.
Yeah, I mean, as they said, charity starts at home. I mean, there's nothing wrong with saying you condemn like Trump's statements, but at the same time, not you. Especially you are part of the government of Saudi Arabia and so on, because you're kind of responsible for these decisions. You're a government official, would say, okay, Trump is what he's doing is bad for not respecting religious freedom, but women are not allowed to drive. Religious freedom almost not exists in our country. So
you mentioned as well that at the beginning, Muslims are people. And with that, you express the spectrum of beliefs within Islam, within the Muslim population with regards to Islam. What do you think it is that is keeping some of these countries and some of these populations within Sharia law or Sharia? Is it small individuals with a lot of knowledge that know the true meaning of Islam and what it represents? Is it a lack of education that is maintaining certain people to believe or have certain values for Sharia to maintain within the community? And what do you think it'll take for a revolution of sorts of the mind to occur in some of these Muslim countries for people to be more open to ideas such as, women can drive, for instance?
Yeah, well, I think there's like a huge combination of factors of, why people believe what they believe. I mean, there's, I think so many books in neuroscience have talked about the subject, but I can definitely say for some, like, for example, Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood, for example, they have worked tremendously on a grassroots level. And one of the things that they were very good at is that they're able to provide social services to people, work on the grassroots, work on the individuals, and then pitch their like selling point to the people. It's like, so when the weather is cold and they give them a pillow and so on, and they tell them, okay, we're doing that because it's part of our faith or our tradition and so on, able to recruit as much people as possible to be part of their organization or supporters of voters and so on.
Yeah, you're not going to bite the hand that's feeding you.
Yeah. So, when it comes to like, what is the true meaning of Islam and what is not? If you happen to believe that Islam is not a religion that is true, then I don't think there's such a thing as a true Islam. So for me, it sounds like a true unicorn. What is a true unicorn? There are beliefs. When it comes to like interpretations and so on, like with every book, including holy books, there are something like there are plausible interpretations of sentences and not a plausible interpretation. Like it's very unlikely to read Mein Kampf and then loving Jews as a result of reading Mein Kampf, because that's a very implausible interpretation. Maybe somebody would look at Mein Kampf and say, wow, seems like Jews are wonderful people.
But that's way on the other end of the bell curve.
That is very, very unlikely, and they have to play so much word gymnastics to be able to achieve that goal. So when it comes to Islamists, or like the people like the Brotherhood, or the people like jihadists, like ISIS, if you look at Wahhabism, for example, Wahhabism did not come with something new. All what they said, Muhammad Abdul Wahhab was a Muslim reformer, and all what he said, that we should not follow modernity and more follow the steps of the Prophet and his friend, like his Sahaba, the people who are around. So he did not come up with something new. It's not like it's a new, like, it's not like there is a book called Wahhabism that the people who are Wahhabis don't refer to themselves as Wahhabis, kind of more a derogatory term. They refer of themselves as Sunni Muslims or Muslims who believe in the following the steps of the Prophet and so on. So Wahhabism did not come with something new, and it's not like a new way of thinking. It's just like, it is a way of thinking that kind of makes it have a stronger theological backing than, let's say, the version of Islam that says women are allowed to have a premarital sex, or for example, people are allowed to drink alcohol or eat pork, because it's just less plausible to read the Quran and say pork is allowed versus reading the Quran and saying you should not eat pork. So that kind of made them to some extent successful in spreading their ideology and so on, because they are not inconsistent. They are very consistent, and also they kind of, I wouldn't say follow logic, but they have logical conclusions or logical deductions that are plausible logical deductions. When it comes to opening of the mind and so on, religious orthodoxy has generally been a problem or an obstacle of free thought and being able to think freely. It's something that existed through history from different religions, and just the concept of, faith versus reason. Faith itself is generally believing things without evidence, and
right.
That's itself create a loophole for dogmatism. And so what could be the counter narrative? The counter narrative would be to show the beauty of reason, to show what societies, when they became more self-critic of themselves, when they engage in more self-reflection, what they have achieved. This could be, it's now like generally kind of common argument is that yes, like, look at us right now, for example, in Iraq. Look at us right now in continuous civil war between Sunnis and Shias, and our country is being destroyed. How about we follow a secular model in which Sunnis and Shias can live together peacefully? So we have to push more, or support the people who push that narrative that takes responsibility and try to change this thing for the better, versus those who admit that there is no problem whatsoever with the culture or the ideology and want to keep the status quo and shift the blame to somebody else.
Yes, and that has been achieved in the past, too, in Baghdad in the 800s, or in Spain in the 11th century. You do see a plurality and with a large Islamic population, but I think, as you said, it's less religion as opposed to more that gets that. It's more secular thinking.
Yeah, I would say it's less orthodoxy, that's for sure. There are people who do follow, let's say, called liberal interpretations, for the lack of a better word, who maybe consider themselves religious. It's just that their version of religion is more liberal. So they are people of faith, but they follow, like, for example, the Quakers Church in Christianity, or the Unitarians. Many of them consider themselves religious. Like, if you ask them, are you religious? They say yes. But at the same time, they say, we're anti-homophobia, we're anti-transphobia. So
they're essentially secular humanists.
Not necessarily. Secular humanism. Yeah, they're definitely humanistic. They're definitely aligned with respect for human rights and so on. But that's definitely the opposite of what religious orthodoxy or orthodox religions. You can see the difference between Orthodox Judaism and secular Judaism, and with Orthodox Islam and Reformed Islam, like the one Majid Nawaz is talking about. Yes, these beliefs had their own phases within history, and what happened is that the Orthodox, or the Orthodox interpretation, due to many circumstances, including that, unfortunately, they happen to have lots of oil in their land, and that's Saudi Arabia and Qatar, that they were able, logistically being able to spread their version of Islam versus the other versions who don't have that much amount of money.
Money talks.
Yeah, so money definitely talks. And especially when you're talking about advocacy and spreading ideas. I mean, just a simple example, like on Facebook. If you have a post and you say boost post, okay? If you have $1 million, you are able to, you make a post, you are able to reach 1 million people with that post. If you have $10, you're able to reach 100 people. And that can be said about everything when it comes to advocacy, is that if you have lots of money, you can send people to the media, you can make them travel all over the world. Let's say you are an evangelical or somebody who wants like convert people to their religion. Somebody who has lots of money has much better leverage than the other because he can travel all over the world, he can stay in hotels, he can talk to people, he can give lectures, and so on. While the people who, let's say, have the good narrative or like the liberal narrative of Islam, I don't say good and bad, but like the liberal narrative or these people have much less, let's say, income and much. I mean, I've met like some actually like what's very random. I was like taking an Uber driver in Virginia. We were like talking about Islam and so on. And this guy was also like a very liberal Muslim, was like very big fan of Majid Nawaz and stuff. But what he's doing, he's working as an Uber driver because he can hardly have a job with what he's doing. Versus somebody who, let's say, supporter of the Brotherhood, can get money from Qatar and can have leverage in Al Jazeera and can travel and probably have a scholarship to study at Georgetown or Yale and he can have positions in advising governments and the UN and so on. So like there's kind of a very big logistical issues that make the Orthodox version of Islam have a better leverage versus the other version.
Right. So you need to find oil somewhere, Faisal, so you can start selling that and we can start boosting your posts.
Yeah.
Now, with Christianity, one of the selling points that Christians like to push with the Bible comes to the idea that it talks about, peace and, living lovingly with one another and loving each other. Going back to the idea of, with the analogy that you use with Mein Kampf, if somebody was to read the Quran, what do you believe would be the takeaway from that? Would it be more of a humanist, ideal, or would it be less of a humanist ideal? Because you had mentioned as well that for progress to occur in some of these countries, we would need to have more innovation, more sharing of ideas. What would be the takeaway? What direction would the Quran take an individual? Would it be more of a peaceful, loving society where everyone works together and shares ideas, or would it be less humanistic and less free?
That's kind of a very difficult question because I think that when you're like reading the Quran, it really depends on which perspective are you reading it from. If you are an atheist and you're reading the Quran, you are not gonna take the verses that look supernatural as seriously as somebody who may believe in a supernatural. I mean, I think, as I said, when it comes to the plausible interpretations and less plausible interpretations, I think that it's very unlikely to read the Quran and conclude that you should eat bacon or you can eat bacon. You can, but it's very unlikely that you can do that. The same thing, if somebody takes the concept of abrogation, the concept that the new verses take over the old verses, when it comes to alcohol. The last verse is the one that talks about alcohol should not be allowed.
And there's two others that say that it is allowed?
To some extent, I think there's one that says like you're not allowed, لا تقربوا الصلاة وأنتم سكارى, is like you're not allowed to drink alcohol when you're praying, or like you should not drink before you're praying. So that's kind of like the previous burden, but the other version says like that's it. It's you're not allowed to drink all the time. So, some people may say, oh well, that he was just talking about wine, but not talking about other. Okay, good luck. If he had a problem with wine, he definitely has a problem with vodka because wine has less alcohol than vodka. So if the main intention was not to actually make people drunk, then it's very likely that he's against all the drinks that make this discussion like in debates between the liberals and the conservatives. So yes, when it comes to like humanistic and what you put as liberal, and I think that it is less likely, not impossible, but less likely to come out with, let's say, a version of Islam that says you can drink alcohol and eat bacon, then you can have a version of Islam. And that's not only that's just like basics, but it comes to other things like jihad and martyrdom,
separation of church and state,
separation of church and state, and so on. I mean, if you start reading the Quran and you read the verse that says this book is infallible, and you take that verse seriously because it's written in a very direct language and so on, it's very unlikely when you read other verses of the Quran, you will say, oh, maybe this verse about killing this, well, we should not take it seriously or ignore it, and so on. Yeah, I mean, it really depends on the methodology. So if you're going to start with the methodology that this book is infallible, this book is perfect, it's applicable all the time, all what is there is applicable all the time, I think you're more likely going to end up with either like conservative or ultra-conservative version than you would come up with a liberal version. If you start the methodology of saying that, okay, it's a book that we may not have actually the real words of God, but maybe these are inspired word of God or something to that extent, maybe you would come out with a more humanist, because in that way you would take the verses that are more like the verses that are more, let's say, humanistic, and ignore the verses that are not humanistic, because you're already acknowledging that this book is not perfect. It may be written in a certain time or things of that sort. So yeah, I think the methodology and the way how you look at the book have like really decide how the way you're going to interpret it and the conclusion you're going to come up with.
So it seems the mindset that at that point in which you approach the book is going to determine which direction you go. So with that idea in terms of the mindset of which you view Islam, many Christian secularists will not believe in Jesus being the one Savior and many of the ideas within the Bible, but will still celebrate Christmas and Easter because it's an opportunity to spend time with their family, and they take it for that purpose. Do you, as a secular ex-Muslim, do you still celebrate events like Ramadan with your family just as an opportunity to spend time with your family?
I think it's Eid that you celebrate. Ramadan. That's the tough one.
I mean, Ramadan is the fasting month. So
yes.
I don't think I'm willing to celebrate that or even engage in that.
Right.
But I mean, I have fasted a few times. Yes. I mean, obviously there is the community aspect of religion. Some people may keep some of it. Some people may, I try my best to kind of find a balance. I mean, I don't really celebrate many of these things. I mean, I like celebrating Darwin Day for some reason, like the New Year's Eve and so on, which are kind of very, very secularized. I mean, there is kind of a secularized version of Eid in which like it's about like family gathering, less about the end of Ramadan, because there are two Eids, and one about the Hajj and one about like the Ramadan, post-Ramadan Eid. Yeah, I mean, I think that when with secular Christianity, or let's say the version of Christianity that like we live in 21st century, has been very, I mean, obviously it's not all over the world. I mean, in Africa and some parts of Asia, the conservative version of Islam, like in Uganda, like gays are still like getting killed and so on. But when it comes to Western Christianity, due to the Enlightenment, that the Christianity as we know it in the West has been watered down significantly. Obviously not 100%, but significantly, that kind of allows for somebody to say that Jesus may not be crucified or something of that sort. I mean, just pre-Enlightenment Europe, that would get you blasphemy and maybe you're going to get crucified or burned on a stake. Yeah. But today, somebody can be a Calvinist who that probably they don't believe in the Trinity, and some people can say that the Bible may have mistakes and nobody's going to tell them that you're blasphemers, because these kind of conversation, due to the, I mean, to a large extent, I would thank the values of the Enlightenment, which were very much secular, that kind of pushed themselves or forced themselves into Christianity, and also due to logistics. I mean, generally, one of the main arguments that has been used to support American secularism was not the fact actually just to protect atheists, but to protect Christians from themselves. Is it which version of Christianity? So we want to create, let's say, a Christian nation. But which version of Christianity we're going to follow? We're going to follow the Methodist. We're going to follow the Evangelical. So secularism has been, to some extent, being used as the protector of religious freedom.
Right.
in multi-faith or multi-sect countries. So that effect had played a very major role in seeing the Christianity we see right now, and the values of reason from John Stuart Mill and John Locke and Voltaire and many others has to some extent forced Christianity to adapt to kind of more modernity. That this thing did not exist in the Muslim world. So the Muslim world didn't have a Stuart Mill or Paine or Jefferson, or the Ottoman Empire has controlled the Middle East. And it was also engaged in a very similar conflict that we see today. It's like, while West was having the Enlightenment era, the Middle East was having a war between the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire, and which version of Islam is going to dominate the other. So while the West was going through the Enlightenment, the Muslim world was going through continuous civil war as we see right now. The Enlightenment did not really touch that part of the world. At least, I mean, it touched it in a very small segment, and we can see that Muslims who don't believe in the Orthodox version. But unfortunately, the Orthodox version has been the one that dominated. And when it comes to like the secular version that just celebrates holidays and so on, it's just, there's no, there are cafeteria Muslims, but they are not as much as cafeteria Catholics. I mean, cafeteria Catholics dominate in a much larger number than cafeteria Muslims and so on.
Right. You would need secularism. I think that the Baptists of Danbury, Connecticut, I mean, you know, they were afraid of not the atheists, but the Congregationalists, and being afraid, not being able not to vote.
Yeah. And back then there were not, I mean, deism was kind of like the atheism, quote unquote, back then. So they were not really afraid of atheism per se, but yeah, they were afraid more of each other.
And what happens, I think, there, it works in America because they were forced to kind of adopt the secular ideals. But I think in Iraq, and where you kind of come into the story, is the fact that the Shia-dominated Iraq could disenfranchise the Sunnis.
Yeah.
And there wasn't enough secularism really to stop that. And they were getting outvoted. Is that kind of lead to the rise of ISIS as you see it?
Yes, I mean I mean if we're gonna talk about how ISIS came to existence, I think we're gonna talk for the next 10 hours.
Right, but it's an example where there's not enough
it is
secularism.
an example. I mean, what is the opposite of the Enlightenment values? Is that you have the authoritarian values, and the authoritarian values have been the concept of individual rights is very foreign to many Muslim majority countries. They hardly have any concept what individual rights is. So when you don't have a concept of individual rights, you're always going to be in constant war about who's going to be the dominant force and who's going to control over the other. Because, I mean, the concept of individual rights is that there are some things that, regardless of the majority of the country they have no control over. So, like, for example, freedom of speech is a concept of individual right. It's like, whether you live in a Christian majority state or an atheist majority state, the Christian right is protected in that majority state, and the atheist right is protected in the.
Right.
But that concept is hardly existent in the Muslim world. That with Iraq, the Shia majority population or the Shia population has been disfranchised for a very long time, and they have so much revenge and so much hatred against the other sect that made, I mean, as a result, I mean, as I said, like most people can be oppressed and oppressors at the same time. So the same person who Saddam killed his brother or Saddam killed her son would be the same person would be advocating for killing Sunnis because the Sunnis were part of the government of Saddam. Yes, I mean, that definitely led to some extent that ISIS ISIS is kind of like the child of Al-Qaeda, in that Al-Qaeda to some extent to be able to they're like mushrooms. They grew in certain environments that allow them to, and in that environment was the continuous struggle between Sunnis and Shias in that country, that the moment that the US pulled off, the Shia dominated government used that as a tool to actually be the dominant force and also cut down the salaries of the Sunni fighters who were the awakening forces that the US has kind of helped to create against Al-Qaeda back then, who were very important force against and with that, the trust between the Sunnis and the Shias started reducing because the Sunnis, I'll generalize on Sunnis because there are some Sunnis who are now fighting ISIS with the Iraqi government, but I'll say that the ones who are like still now under ISIS controlled areas who could be anti-ISIS, but at the same time they see the Iraqi government much less trustworthy and worse than ISIS because they're going to discriminate against them for being Sunni. So they have two choices: the Iraqi sectarian government or ISIS, and some people, it seems that they would prefer ISIS over the Syrian government.
The devil you know versus the devil you
not only the devil you know is that let's say you want to be the person who's going to fight, and you say, okay, I'm going to ask the Iraqi government to give me reinforcements and weapons and so on. Considering that ISIS is like holding things very strongly, you cannot trust the Iraqi government to actually do the fight. Like they will tell you, okay, we're going to give you some weapons, and then the Iraqi government will be like, oh, I'm sorry, like yeah, maybe I'm not. I just said yes, but now I just changed my mind. So.
Now you've got a bounty on your head already.
Yeah. Now you're like in public. ISIS is looking up for you. So that's kind of helps ISIS to some extent continuously gaining control. And I mean, ISIS is now transcends Iraq. I mean, they have places in Syria as well who also to some extent with Syria. I mean, the anti-ISIS forces are in Syria are also stuck between a war because they are against Assad on one hand and they're against ISIS on the other. Who's going to help these guys? I mean, you have Russian planes flying, killing them, and you have Assad throwing barrel bombs, and you have ISIS chasing them. So that's why you don't really see that much of anti-ISIS forces. I mean, they exist. It's just like, first of all, they're less in numbers, and they're less in power, and power really matters. And when it comes to warfare, I mean, you can have 5,000 very well trained, very equipped soldiers can defeat an army of 100,000 if they are less weaker. And so it's not really about how many numbers on each side. It's just like who has most power when it comes to these conflicts.
So this is Mythicist Milwaukee, and we have been speaking to Faisal Saeed Al Mutar here in Madison, Wisconsin. Currently, Faisal, you are in Wisconsin for the Free Thought Festival, the 5th version, hosted by atheists, humanists, and agnostics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. After this event and your working with other organizations, as you've mentioned, what's next for you?
Well, I think I'm going to just take some break from speeches for now and just accept Allah as my savior. Just kidding.
You heard it here first.
I just converted everyone. No, I mean, what's next?
Faisal, well known for satire.
Yeah, I mean, I may like focus on like probably like this next month or two. I need to focus on doing some fundraising for the project I'm working on, as well as.
Can you specify your project?
Yeah, the movements.org in particular, because as I said, like we're fighting against people with millions of dollars of funding, and these projects need to, like the project that we're working on, we're helping, need to expand, needs funding, need grants and so on. So we would need that funding to at least, by comparison, like we get 1% of the funding of ISIS. That's not much. We need much more to actually be able to fight against. So I'm going to do some of that, and also with our pace, like with publishing. Now we kind of have a collection of like secular voices from the Arab and the Muslim world. Maybe I'll try to double it and maybe triple it for the next month or two, because there are so many voices. They come out to me like, out of a sudden, like they message me on Twitter and Facebook, and they're like this, and I try to talk to them and so on. I'll try to kind of like with all these voices that we publish, I'll try to create kind of like a movement between them. So, and that way, hopefully like give them with more media training, because that's, I think, one of the biggest issues that we face when it comes to media presence is that like with people like the Islamists, the Brotherhood and stuff, most of them receive media training. And what happened is, I mean, for those who did media interviews or TV interviews, so you only have like, we don't have like something like the podcast like here. You have somebody like speaking for 3 minutes, another person speaking for 3 minutes, ending session. So all interviews 15 minutes. Well, you see with the Islamists, because of the media training they've had, they actually have talking points. They can talk in 3 minutes and sound bites and so on, that secularists, many of them don't know how to do. Like you ask them a question and they will answer you for 25 minutes. While in fact, when you are appearing on CNN, you cannot do that for 25 minutes.
You have to have a stump speech.
You have to have a quick speech in which you give your talking points as a strategic way. So we're hopefully trying our best, like within the next few months, that I try to connect these secular activists in the Arab world or from Arab countries and Muslim countries to actually have this media training, so that when they appear on the medium, when they try to raise funds, when they try to talk about their projects, they're able to, within this 5 minutes on CNN and 5 minutes on Fox or whatever, they're able to give their message in an eloquent way, people that something that most people don't understand, and not speak in this grandiose language that everybody would be like, what the hell I'm listening to? So I think that's pretty much what's next for me.
Will you be at Reason Rally 2016 in DC this year?
I hope so. Yeah. I mean, I was planning to attend. It's really, I mean, it all depends on the mood. I mean, DC is not really far from where I live. It's like 3 hours, 4 hours. If I was like jet lagged from so many flights before, I may want to sleep on that day. But if I see that I'm not tired, I would just like take the train to Reason Rally. I think it's going to be a big one.
Do you have any recommendations for, like, I think part of this needs to be one at the grassroots level as well. Would you have recommendations for schools necessarily? Because I see a lot of this wear a hijab day, you know, for Americans. What do you think of that? And is there something better?
Yeah, Wear a Hijab Day, I think, has created so much controversy. I mean, I understand that many white people seeing this effect of like anti-Muslim bigotry and just want to show a movement of solidarity. That being said, I think that when it comes to campuses, I would like to thank University of Wisconsin-Madison to bring me here. And I think that they should do the same to bring the feminists from the Muslim world, the gay rights activists from the Muslim world, because they're hardly ignored. I mean, as I said, the people who get to speak for the Muslims and for the Arabs and so on are generally the Islamists and the Brotherhood and the people who want to push that narrative of victimhood and so on. So I think one of the things schools can do is to start a conversation in the campuses. Especially, most of the campuses have a group called the Muslim Student Association, the MSA, and so on. These people are living in generally bubbles in which they just talk to themselves. It's good to bring speakers who may challenge their ideas, who may bring a conversation to campus about extremism and human rights in the Muslim world. So I think that's one of the things, most important things campuses should do, because that's where intelligent discussion can actually happen. It's not going to be Twitter. It's not going to be Facebook. Campuses is the best place to actually have a conversation.
Right, and not to limit free speech either.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Which we see too often, and saying you can't speak here.
Hopefully, I'm not going to be banned from any future campus groups, but yeah.
Well, we hope so too, because we want to help promote your narrative. We really like what you're doing on movements.org, as well as the Global Secular Humanist Movement. You can Google Faisal directly, because again, the West doesn't own humanist values. They really belong to everyone, and to get the word out, especially to the brave activists. I mean, I get to do it from the safety of Faisal's hotel room, which is safe. I'm not in Baghdad with ISIS bearing down on me. So it's really impressive.
Yeah, thank you so much. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your insights. This has been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
And this is Mythicist Milwaukee signing off on another fascinating interview.
and who will be